Go ahead, one of the applicants laughed loudly. Maybe the janitor wants the billionaire's bodyguard job too. The laughter rolled across the polished training floor inside Kensington Global Security Headquarters in Dallas, Texas, bouncing off the glass walls and steel beams high above. More than 60 elite candidates stood in crisp tactical uniforms, each carrying years of military or executive protection experience on paper. Then there was Ethan Brooks, 38 years old, a white American single father wearing faded denim, worn work boots, and a simple gray shirt that had clearly seen better days. Nothing about him looked expensive. Nothing about him demanded attention. And yet, something about the quiet way he stood made one person in the room hesitate before joining the laughter. Claire Kensington watched from the elevated observation platform overlooking the evaluation arena. At 34, she had built one of the fastest-growing technology companies in America, a business worth billions of dollars. But success had also attracted threats she could no longer ignore. Every letter from corporate security sounded more urgent than the last. Every public appearance required tighter protection. Today wasn't simply a hiring event. It was the beginning of finding someone she could trust with her life. She folded her arms as the candidates lined up below. Most carried themselves exactly as expected. Perfect posture, expensive gear, confident smiles. Ethan carried none of those things. Instead, he quietly placed a folded application on the registration table before stepping back without saying a word. "You here to fix the air conditioner?" Another applicant joked. "Wrong building, buddy." More laughter followed. Ethan simply smiled politely. "I'm here for the interview." His calm voice somehow made the room even louder with amusement. Claire exchanged a brief glance with her chief of security. "Who approved him?" she asked. Her security director looked down at the digital roster. "Background check," says former military. "Nothing unusual. No recomendations. No active contracts. Currently employed as a maintenance technician." Claire nodded slowly. Maintenance. Technician. That certainly didn't match the resumes of decorated operators surrounding him. Still, company policy gave every qualified applicant the same opportunity. Down below, another candidate stepped closer until he stood only a few feet from Ethan. He was taller, younger, broad-shouldered, and carried himself like someone accustomed to winning every room he entered. "You sure you're in the right place?" he asked with a grin that invited another round of laughter. Ethan met his eyes without the slightest hint of anger. "That's what I'm here to find out." There was no challenge in his voice. No prejudice. No attempt to impress anyone. Just quiet certainty. For reasons Claire couldn't explain, she stopped reviewing the resumes on her tablet. Her attention stayed on the man everyone else had already dismissed. She had spent years negotiating billion-dollar acquisitions, reading investors, competitors, politicians, and executives. Confidence was easy to fake. Arrogance was even easier. But genuine calm under public humiliation was something she rarely encountered. Somewhere deep inside, a question quietly surfaced. What kind of man walks into a room where everyone expects him to fail and never feels the need to prove them wrong? The answer would arrive much sooner than anyone inside Kensington Global Security expected. The registration process continued with mechanical precision as candidates were called one by one to verify identification, employment history, certifications, and physical qualifications. Ethan Brooks waited patiently near the back of the line with his hands folded loosely in front of him. He checked the time on an old wristwatch, not because he was nervous, but because he promised his 10-year-old daughter, Lily, that he would be home before dinner if everything went according to plan. The promise mattered more than the interview. Earlier that morning, long before the Dallas skyline caught its first golden light, Ethan had already been awake for nearly 2 hours. He packed Lily's lunch, braided her light brown hair the way she liked it, and smiled when she reminded him that today was her history presentation at school. She had practiced it 3 times in their small kitchen while he flipped pancakes on a cast-iron skillet that had belonged to his late father. Their little house sat on a quiet street outside the city, modest but warm, filled with second-hand furniture, family photographs, and the comforting smell of fresh coffee that never seemed to leave the walls. Money had always been tight after his wife passed away several years earlier, but Ethan refused to let hardship define the atmosphere inside their home. Lily had learned early that kindness cost nothing, respect was earned quietly, and promises were never made unless they could be kept. After dropping her off at school, Ethan drove to the commercial maintenance company, where he repaired elevators, heating systems, and electrical equipment across office buildings throughout Dallas. His co-workers knew him as dependable, never late, never loud, never interested in office gossip. They did not know why his hands remained so steady under pressure or why he could solve difficult mechanical problems without rushing. They only joked that nothing seemed capable of surprising Ethan anymore. Around noon, his supervisor walked into the maintenance shop carrying an envelope. Inside was the printed invitation to Kensington Global Security's Executive Protection Recruitment event. One of the company's longtime clients had quietly recommended Ethan after watching him calmly help organize an emergency evacuation during a power outage several months earlier. Ethan almost declined. He had built a simple life, one focused entirely on raising Lily. Yet the salary listed in the invitation could change everything. Better health insurance, college savings, a safer neighborhood, maybe even enough money to replace the old pickup truck that rattled every morning on the drive to school. He looked at the invitation for several minutes before carefully folding it into his pocket. When he picked Lily up that afternoon, she noticed he seemed unusually thoughtful. "Big day tomorrow?" she asked from the passenger seat. Ethan smiled softly without taking his eyes off the road. "Maybe," she grinned. "You always say maybe when you already know the answer." He laughed, quietly. "I guess I do." "Will you still be home for dinner?" she asked. "No matter what happens," he answered. "I will always come home." Those words stayed with him as he stood inside the gleaming headquarters surrounded by polished floors, expensive watches, and confident strangers measuring success by appearances. Across the room, Claire continued observing every candidate from above, but her attention returned again and again to the quiet maintenance technician who never competed for attention, never defended himself against ridicule, and somehow carried himself with the peaceful confidence of someone whose greatest victories had never needed an audience. Claire Kensington had learned long ago that success attracted admiration from a distance, but suspicion up close. At 34 years old, she had transformed a struggling cybersecurity startup into one of the most influential technology companies in the United States, signing contracts that protected hospitals, financial institutions, and government agencies. Every major achievement had come with another anonymous threat, another warning letter, another attempt to intimidate her into abandoning projects that challenged powerful competitors. She no longer believed danger announced itself loudly. Real danger usually arrived wearing an expensive suit and a confident smile. That was exactly why today's evaluation mattered. She stepped away from the observation window and entered a private conference room where her executive security team was waiting around a polished walnut table. Digital maps, schedules, and security reports filled the large display screen surrounding them. Daniel Mercer, her longtime director of security, stood as she entered. "Everything is ready," he said calmly. "Final evaluations begin in 15 minutes. Claire nodded, but remained standing near the window, overlooking the training floor below. "Tell me something honestly, Daniel." He looked at her curiously. "Have we been searching for the strongest applicant or the right one?" Daniel paused before answering. "Those are not always the same person." Claire smiled faintly because that was exactly the answer she had hoped to hear. During the past 6 months, 3 separate executive protection firms had assigned bodyguards to her team. Every one of them possessed impressive resumes, advanced tactical certifications, and outstanding physical conditioning. None of them lasted. One treated every conversation like a competition. Another constantly reminded everyone about his military accomplishments. A third spent more time watching social media than watching the people around him. They were highly qualified professionals, yet none understood that protecting another person required humility before confidence. As she reviewed the newest group of applicants through the glass, once more, the contrast became impossible to ignore. Most candidates talked loudly, compared achievements, and carefully positioned themselves where they could easily be noticed. Ethan Brooks had quietly moved aside to help an elderly receptionist gather paperwork after several folders accidentally slipped from her hands. He returned every document without drawing attention to himself, and then stepped back into line as though nothing unusual had happened. Claire noticed something else. He never looked toward the observation deck, searching for approval. He simply continued waiting his turn. Daniel followed her gaze. "Maintenance technician," he said after checking the file again. "Former Army service many years ago. Honorable discharge. Employment history is remarkably stable. No disciplinary record. References describe him as dependable." Claire accepted the electronic file and studied it more carefully. There were gaps she could not explain. Several assignments remained unusually vague. Nothing alarming, just incomplete. She closed the file and looked down again. Ethan stood exactly where he had been several minutes earlier, while another applicant enthusiastically described championship trophies to anyone willing to listen. Ethan simply listened politely without interrupting. Claire folded her arms. "Confidence speaks," she said quietly. "Character waits." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Do you think he belongs here?" Claire watched Ethan smile warmly as another nervous applicant accidentally dropped a water bottle, and he immediately picked it up before returning it with a simple nod. She answered without taking her eyes off the training floor. "I think everyone else is trying to convince us who they are. He is the only one who is not trying at all. Sometimes that is exactly the person worth watching." The loudspeaker echoed through the training hall with calm authority. "All applicants, please proceed to evaluation Arena 1. Conversation stopped almost instantly as dozens of candidates walked toward the polished performance floor, surrounded by observation balconies and digital scoreboards. Bright overhead lights reflected across the smooth training mats while executives, instructors, and security specialists quietly took their seats. Ethan Brooks walked with the same unhurried pace he had maintained all morning. He neither rushed nor lingered behind. He simply followed the instructions like everyone else. The atmosphere changed as the lead evaluator stepped into the center of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "today is not about finding the strongest person in this building. We are looking for judgment, discipline, emotional control, and professionalism under pressure." Several applicants exchanged amused smiles, as though those words were little more than formalities. The evaluator continued. "You will participate in a series of controlled assessments. Every exercise is designed to measure decision-making before physical ability." Before he could continue, a confident voice interrupted from the front row. "Then this should be easy." The speaker was Mason Reed, a nationally recognized executive protection specialist whose reputation had spread quickly through the room before the evaluations even began. Tall, athletic, and impeccably dressed, Mason carried himself with effortless confidence that naturally attracted attention. Several applicants admired him openly, while others quietly accepted that he was the favorite to receive the position. His eyes wandered across the line until they settled on Ethan. A slow grin appeared. Although, Mason said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear, "I think we have at least one applicant who misunderstood the invitation." Laughter immediately spread across the room again. "Maintenance uniforms are usually downstairs," another candidate added. "Maybe they need somebody to fix the coffee machine." Ethan looked toward the speakers and offered nothing more than a polite smile. "Good luck today," he said sincerely. His calm response somehow made the jokes feel even louder. Mason stepped closer, folding his arms comfortably. "You really think you belong here?" Ethan answered in the same quiet tone. "Everyone deserves the chance to be evaluated fairly." Mason chuckled. "Confidence is one thing. Delusion is another." Several nearby candidates laughed again, expecting Ethan to defend himself or argue back. Instead, he simply nodded once. Maybe the evaluation will answer that question. The room unexpectedly became quieter. Claire Kensington watched everything from the observation platform without saying a word. She noticed that Ethan never reacted to the insults themselves. Instead, he focused entirely on listening to the evaluator, almost as though the distractions barely existed. Daniel Mercer leaned slightly toward her. Most applicants lose emotional control before they ever reach the assessment floor. Claire nodded thoughtfully. He has had every opportunity to prove them wrong with words. Daniel glanced toward Ethan. But he has not. Claire answered softly. People who know who they are rarely feel the need to announce it. Down below, the evaluator called for silence once more. Our first assessment will be conducted in pairs. A digital screen illuminated beside the arena, displaying names one after another. Candidates looked upward with growing anticipation as assignments appeared. When the final pairing flashed across the screen, a ripple of surprise swept through the room. Ethan Brooks would face Mason Reed in the opening evaluation. Mason smiled with unmistakable confidence as several applicants whispered that the maintenance technician's interview was about to end before it had truly begun. Ethan simply looked at the screen, took one slow breath, and quietly walked toward the center of the arena without changing his expression, while somewhere above, Claire found herself watching him more closely than anyone else. The arena fell into complete silence as Ethan Brooks and Mason Reed stepped onto the training mat from opposite sides. There were no flashing lights, no dramatic music, only the quiet hum of the ventilation system and the faint sound of dozens of people holding their breath. The lead evaluator raised one hand. This is a controlled executive protection assessment. Your objective is not to defeat your partner. Your objective is to demonstrate awareness, restraint, judgment, and control. The exercise ends immediately when one participant establishes clear positional advantage. Mason nodded confidently before stretching his shoulders. Do not worry, he said with a smile that reached almost everyone except Ethan. I will make this quick. A few candidates laughed again. Ethan simply inclined his head politely. Thank you. Mason blinked, almost disappointed that he could not provoke any reaction. Claire Kensington leaned slightly closer against the glass overlooking the arena. She noticed something unusual. Every experienced fighter she had previously hired displayed subtle signs before competition. Tightened shoulders, restless hands, controlled breathing. Ethan displayed none of them. His breathing remained slow and even. His posture looked relaxed enough to suggest he was standing in line at a grocery store rather than preparing for an evaluation watched by an entire executive team. Daniel Mercer quietly folded his arms. Interesting, he whispered. The evaluator lowered his hand. Begin. Mason moved first with smooth confidence, circling lightly while studying Ethan's posture. Ethan adjusted his position by only a few inches, never rushing forward and never retreating. His eyes stayed focused, calm, almost patient. Around the arena, whispers slowly faded as spectators realized he was reading every movement without appearing tense. Mason smiled again. You have good composure, he admitted. Most people would already be nervous. Ethan answered softly. Being nervous does not improve good decisions. Mason took another careful step, testing distance rather than forcing action. Ethan mirrored him. Naturally, never wasting movement. Seconds passed. Then another 10. The room gradually realized something unexpected. Mason was beginning to hesitate. Every small adjustment he made was quietly anticipated before it happened. Ethan was not reacting late. He seemed prepared before each movement even began. Claire noticed Daniel watching the same thing. He is not chasing the moment, Daniel murmured. He is waiting for it. Then everything changed almost too quickly for most people to follow. Mason confidently shifted forward to establish control exactly as the assessment required. Ethan responded with one smooth, economical movement that redirected momentum without aggression or unnecessary force. In a single balanced motion, he established a clean positional advantage exactly within the evaluator's guidelines before immediately releasing pressure and stepping backward again. The entire exchange lasted only a moment. No dramatiche lichen. No excessive display. Just remarkable timing, precision, and complete control. Mason looked surprised more than embarrassed as he calmly regained his footing. Ethan immediately extended a hand with genuine respect. Thank you, he said sincerely. Mason accepted it after a brief pause, still trying to understand what had just happened. Around the arena, nobody laughed. Nobody whispered. Even the instructors exchanged thoughtful glances instead of applause. The evaluator slowly lowered his clipboard before looking toward the observation deck. "Assessment complete," he announced. "Excellent demonstration of restraint." Claire realized she had unconsciously stepped closer to the glass. She had expected someone to impress the room with strength. Instead, the quiet maintenance technician had impressed everyone by refusing to use more than necessary. Daniel finally broke the silence. That was not luck. Claire never looked away from Ethan as he calmly thanked the evaluator before walking toward the edge of the mat with the same humility he had carried into the building hours earlier. Her voice was almost a whisper. "No," she replied. "That was someone who has spent a lifetime learning the difference between proving power and protecting people." The silence inside the training hall lingered long after the evaluation officially ended. One by one, the remaining candidates resumed quiet conversations, but the confidence that had filled the room earlier had noticeably faded. Mason Reed walked back toward the waiting area without anger, only thoughtful disbelief. He replayed the brief exchange again and again in his mind, searching for the exact moment control had quietly slipped away. He had competed against decorated professionals throughout his career, yet the maintenance technician had never once appeared interested in winning. That realization unsettled him more than the result itself. Upstairs, Claire Kensington entered the executive conference room, where Daniel Mercer and two senior evaluators were already reviewing electronic reports. One instructor looked up immediately. "His technique is unusually disciplined," she said. "There's almost no wasted movement. Everything he does has purpose." Daniel nodded before opening Ethan's personnel file once again. "There are details here that deserve another look." He enlarged several sections on the display. Honorable military service, outstanding conduct evaluations, specialized instructor certifications issued years earlier. Then, unexpectedly, additional archived records became available after a secondary verification request completed through a federal database. The room grew noticeably quieter. Claire stepped closer to the screen. "What changed?" Daniel answered without taking his eyes from the file. His older training records were recently declassified. Another evaluator leaned forward. He was not simply assigned to security operations. Daniel slowly scrolled through the newly available information. He spent several years instructing advanced defensive protection techniques for military personnel before requesting voluntary separation from active service. Claire read the documents carefully. There were commendations for leadership, crisis management, instructor excellence, and exceptional judgment under pressure. There were no headlines, no medals displayed for attention, no interviews, no public recognition. Only years of quiet service followed by an equally quiet departure. Why would someone with these qualifications spend years repairing elevators? One executive asked. Daniel closed the file gently. Sometimes the better question is not why someone left. It is what mattered enough for them to leave. Claire remained thoughtful. She remembered the promise Ethan had mentioned while checking the time on his old wristwatch. She remembered the way he helped the receptionist without expecting recognition. She remembered that after completing the evaluation, he had thanked both his opponent and the instructor before quietly stepping aside. Nothing about him suggested a man searching for status. Everything suggested someone protecting a different priority. Downstairs, Ethan sat alone in a small waiting area with a paper cup of coffee. While several applicants continued discussing scores and rankings, he quietly opened his wallet. Inside rested a small school photograph of Lily smiling with two missing front teeth and holding a blue ribbon she had earned at a science fair the previous year. Ethan smiled softly before checking the time once again. If traffic remained light, he would still make it home before dinner exactly as promised. A young security assistant approached him hesitantly. "Mr. Brooks," she said, "Miss Kensington would like to speak with you privately before the next evaluation." Ethan slipped the photograph carefully back into his wallet and stood. "Of course." He followed her through the bright executive corridor with the same steady pace he had maintained since arriving that morning. Behind the glass walls overlooking the city, Claire waited beside the conference table with Ethan's file resting quietly in front of her. For the first time since building her company, she realized she was no longer interviewing a candidate simply because of what he could do. She wanted to understand the kind of man who could walk away from extraordinary achievements without bitterness, choose an ordinary life without regret, and still carry himself with the quiet dignity that money, titles, and reputation could never buy. Claire Kensington remained standing beside the conference table as Ethan Brooks entered the executive conference room. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Dallas skyline, where the late afternoon sun reflected across rows of glass towers in warm shades of gold. Daniel Mercer quietly closed the door behind them before stepping aside. For a brief moment, no one spoke. Claire studied Ethan with the same careful attention she reserved for high-stakes negotiations. "Please have a seat, Mr. Brooks," she said warmly. Ethan nodded. "Thank you, Miss Kensington." He sat comfortably without appearing intimidated by the luxurious surroundings. Claire noticed something she had not seen in years. Most executives, politicians, and consultants who entered this room immediately admired the artwork, the imported furniture, or the panoramic view. Ethan never glanced at any of it. His attention remained entirely on the conversation. Claire opened his personnel file slowly. "Your record surprised us." Ethan smiled gently. "Sometimes old records tell only part of story." Claire folded her hands. "You spent years teaching defensive protection techniques." Ethan answered honestly. "For a while." "Why leave?" she asked. The question hung quietly between them. Ethan looked toward the city for a brief second before answering. "Because one day I realized my daughter needed a father more than the Army needed another instructor." His words carried no regret, only peaceful certainty. Daniel exchanged a glance with Claire. Neither of them interrupted. Ethan continued softly. "My wife became seriously ill. After she passed away, there was no decision left to make. Lily was still very young. Children remember who comes home. They do not remember impressive job titles." Claire lowered her eyes to the family photograph resting inside his open file. For the first time in many years, the billion-dollar contracts waiting on her desk seemed strangely small compared to that simple truth. Before she could respond, Daniel's secure tablet vibrated sharply across the conference table. His expression changed almost immediately as he reviewed the incoming report. "Miss Kensington," he said calmly, "our intelligence team just forwarded an updated security assessment." Claire accepted the tablet. The message contained photographs, travel schedules, and recommendations regarding an upcoming shareholder presentation scheduled for the following morning. Anonymous online threats had increased dramatically overnight. Security analysts recommended expanding executive protection immediately. Claire remained composed, but Ethan noticed the subtle tightening around her eyes that revealed concern hidden beneath professional confidence. He spoke quietly. "May I ask a question?" Claire nodded. "Of course." Ethan looked toward the schedule displayed on the tablet. "Has anything about tomorrow's event changed since the original plan?" Daniel frowned slightly. "Not yet." Ethan leaned forward just enough to study the layout. "Then I would change it." Claire looked up with curiosity. "Based on what?" Ethan answered without hesitation. "Predictability creates opportunity. The safest plan is often the one nobody expects." Daniel glanced at the security diagrams again. The suggestion sounded remarkably simple, yet as he reviewed the routes more carefully, he realized several arrival points unnecessarily repeated previous public appearances. Ethan was not criticizing the plan. He was quietly improving it. Claire noticed something extraordinary. He never once suggested dramatic tactics or complicated strategies. Instead, every recommendation centered on reducing unnecessary attention, protecting employees, and the following morning arrived with clear Texas skies and a crisp breeze moving between the downtown buildings as employees, investors, and invited guests gathered outside Kensington Global Headquarters for the annual shareholder presentation. Security officers quietly guided visitors through designated entrances while television crews prepared their cameras across the street. Everything appeared orderly, yet nothing about the arrangement matched the original schedule. Overnight, Daniel Mercer had approved every adjustment Ethan Brooks recommended. Arrival routes had been simplified, unnecessary congestion had been eliminated, and employees were quietly redirected through different access points without creating confusion. Most guests never realized anything had changed. That was exactly the point. Ethan arrived early wearing a tailored dark suit provided by the company. But even in professional attire, he carried himself with the same quiet humility that had defined him from the beginning. He walked the perimeter slowly, greeting reception staff, maintenance workers, and security personnel with equal respect. Claire Kensington noticed the difference immediately. Unlike several previous contractors who focused entirely on staying close to her, Ethan seemed equally concerned with everyone else's safety. He paused briefly beside a nervous young receptionist. "First big event?" he asked kindly. She smiled awkwardly. "Is it that obvious?" Ethan nodded gently. "Take one slow breath before each guest arrives. People usually remember how you made them feel more than how quickly you checked their badge." Her shoulders visibly relaxed. Claire watched the exchange from several yards away. Leadership, she realized, was not always loud. Sometimes it looked exactly like that. Minutes later, Daniel approached carrying a secure tablet. "Our monitoring team confirmed something interesting," he said quietly. Several individuals who had been posting anonymous threats online appeared near the original entrance this morning. Claire looked toward the empty area that had once been scheduled as her arrival point. They were waiting for a schedule that no longer existed. Daniel nodded. Your revised route avoided unnecessary attention exactly as Ethan predicted. Claire turned toward Ethan, who was calmly assisting an elderly board member navigate a short flight of entrance steps before returning to his position without expecting acknowledgement. She smiled to herself. Good security, she remembered him saying, was usually invisible. Inside the main auditorium, hundreds of guests filled the seats as the presentation prepared to begin. Daniel stepped onto the stage microphone. "Before we begin today's program, there is one matter I would like to recognize." Curious whispers spread across the audience. Ethan looked genuinely surprised as Daniel invited him forward. Claire joined him on stage, holding a small folder in her hands. "Yesterday," she began, "many people judged a man by his clothing, his profession, and assumptions they made before speaking with him. Today I would rather judge him by his character." The room became completely still. Claire continued, "Professional excellence matters. Experience matters. But integrity matters even more. Mr. Ethan Brooks reminded all of us that true strength never demands attention. It quietly earns trust." She extended a company identification badge bearing the title Executive Protection Advisor. Ethan accepted it respectfully, almost hesitant to become the center of attention. From the audience, Mason Reed slowly stood. Without hesitation, he began applauding. One by one, the instructors followed. Then the security team. Then the employees. Soon the entire auditorium rose together in quiet appreciation. Ethan looked toward Mason, who offered a sincere nod instead of words. Ethan returned the gesture with the same warmth he had shown everyone since walking through the company's front doors. Claire noticed something remarkable as the applause gradually faded. The room that had once laughed at the quiet single father now stood together in respectful silence. And in that silence, every person present seemed to understand the same lesson. Character revealed over time will always outlast confidence displayed for a moment. The applause slowly faded, but the feeling it left behind remained long after the auditorium returned to its normal rhythm. Employees resumed conversations in softer voices. Investors shook hands across polished aisles, and reporters packed away their cameras. Yet something inside the building had quietly changed. Ethan Brooks looked down at the identification badge resting in his hand before carefully slipping it into the inside pocket of his jacket. It felt no heavier than before, yet he understood the responsibility it represented. Claire Kensington stepped beside him as the audience gradually dispersed. Do you have a few minutes before you leave? She asked. Ethan smiled apologetically. I wish I did, but I made a promise. Claire tilted her head with quiet curiosity. Your daughter? Ethan nodded. She finishes school in 45 minutes. I have never wanted her wondering if I was coming. Claire laughed softly, not because the answer surprised her, but because it somehow explained everything she had learned about him during the past 2 days. Then I will not keep you. As they walked together toward the building entrance, employees who had barely noticed Ethan the day before now greeted him with genuine respect. The maintenance staff shook his hand. Receptionists smiled warmly. Even Mason Reed approached one final time before leaving the building. I judged you far too quickly, Mason admitted honestly. I was wrong. Ethan accepted the apology without hesitation. We all make first impressions, he replied. The important part is what we choose to do after them. Mason smiled. I hope we work together again someday. So do I, Ethan answered. Outside, the warm afternoon sun reflected across the Dallas skyline as Ethan climbed into his aging pickup truck. The engine still rattled exactly as it always had, and he smiled because some things never needed to change. Less than an hour later, he parked outside Lily's elementary school, just as children began spilling through the front doors, carrying backpacks almost as large as themselves. Lily spotted him immediately. Dad, she shouted happily before running toward the truck with the excitement only a child can bring into an ordinary afternoon. Ethan stepped out and opened his arms. How did the history presentation go? He asked. She grinned proudly. I remembered every single word. Ethan smiled. I knew you would. As they drove home through familiar neighborhood streets, Lily looked over curiously. Did your interview go well? Ethan thought for a moment before answering. I met some very good people today. She laughed. That means yes. He smiled without correcting her. That evening, while spaghetti simmered on the stove and soft music played from an old kitchen radio, there was a gentle knock at the front door. Ethan opened it to find Claire standing on the porch, dressed simply in jeans and a light sweater, holding a paper bag from a neighborhood bakery. I hope I am not interrupting dinner, she said, with an almost shy smile. Ethan looked surprised. Not at all. Lily appeared beside her father. Claire knelt slightly and held out the bag. Someone told me congratulations were in order for a very successful history presentation. Lily's eyes widened. How did you know? Claire smiled. Your father mentioned it yesterday. He sounded very proud. For a brief moment, no one spoke. The evening breeze moved gently through the trees, and the fading sunlight painted the quiet street in shades of gold. Claire looked at Ethan with sincere gratitude. Thank you, she said softly. Not for yesterday. For reminding me that the strongest people are usually the ones who never need to tell anyone they are strong. Ethan looked toward his daughter, standing safely beside him before answering with the same quiet dignity that had guided every step of his journey. At the end of the day, titles fade, applause becomes silence, and success is measured differently in every home. The only victories that truly last are the ones the people we love remember when we walk through the front door.